Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. On the night of December 30th, the year 2000, a quiet residential street in Setagaya, Tokyo, became the site of something that would haunt Japan for decades. Inside a modest two-story home, a family of 4 lay dead, their lives taken with brutal efficiency in the hours just after midnight. But what made this crime different, what made it impossible to forget, was not just the violence. It was what happened after. The killer did not flee. He stayed. He moved through the rooms as if the house were his own, sitting at the family computer, eating food from the refrigerator, resting on their sofa. He left behind fingerprints, DNA, clothing, even traces of sand that could be tracked to a specific region. And yet, despite all of this evidence, despite one of the most extensive investigations in Japanese history, no one was ever caught. The question that lingered was not just who had done this, but why someone would linger in a house of death, calm and unbothered, as if time itself had stopped mattering. The Miyazawa family had lived in that house for years. Mikio Miyazawa, 44 years old, worked as an illustrator and animator, spending long hours at his desk creating scenes for children's books and educational programs. His wife, Yasuko, was 41, a woman known in the neighborhood for her warmth and her careful attention to their 2 children. Their daughter, Nina, was 8 years old, a shy girl who liked to draw like her father, often sitting beside him with her own sketch pad. Their son, Ray, was only 6, still small enough to climb into his mother's lap when he felt uncertain. The house itself was narrow but comfortable, tucked into a neighborhood that had once been farmland, but had slowly transformed into rows of homes with small gardens and tidy gates. The Miyazawa home sat at the end of a lane, backing up against a small public park that was empty most evenings. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors by name, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. That sense of safety, that belief in predictability, was what made the events of that night so incomprehensible, because what occurred inside that house was not the result of a sudden rage or a desperate robbery. It was methodical, patient, and deeply wrong, in ways that defied easy explanation. Mikio had been working late that evening in his second-floor study, the soft glow of his desk lamp visible from the street. Yasuko had tucked the children into bed earlier, reading to them from a storybook about animals in a forest. Nina had fallen asleep first, curled on her side with her hand under her cheek. Ray had fought sleep a little longer, asking his mother questions about the pictures, until finally his eyes closed and his breathing slowed. The house was quiet. Outside, the December air was cold and still, the kind of night where sounds carried farther than usual, where a footstep on gravel could be heard from across a yard. At some point after 11, Yasuko went upstairs to check on Mikio, bringing him tea and reminding him not to stay up too late. He smiled, nodded, told her he would finish soon. She went back downstairs, likely intending to tidy the kitchen or fold laundry before bed. It was around this time, investigators would later believe, that someone entered the house. The back door, which faced the park, had been left unlocked, a common habit in a neighborhood where crime was almost unheard of. No alarm was triggered. No dog barked. The intruder moved inside with a confidence that suggested familiarity, or at least a complete lack of fear. He did not rush. He did not stumble. He simply walked in, and once inside, he did not leave for many hours. The first sign that something was wrong came from Nina's room. She had woken, perhaps hearing a noise, perhaps sensing something out of place in the way children sometimes do. She climbed out of bed and opened her door, stepping into the hallway. What she saw, or who she encountered, remains unknown, but it was here that the violence began. She was attacked quickly, efficiently, her small body overwhelmed before she could scream loud enough to wake her brother. The weapon used was a kitchen knife taken from the Miyazawa home itself, a detail that would later unsettle investigators. The intruder had not brought his own blade, but had instead taken one from the family he intended to kill, as if the decision to harm them had been made only after entering. Yasuko must have heard something, a thud, a muffled cry, because she came upstairs and found her daughter in the hallway, bleeding and barely conscious. She tried to help, tried to shield her, but the attacker was already there, moving with a speed and force that left no room for resistance. Yasuko was struck repeatedly, her injuries severe and immediate. She fell near her daughter, her body positioned as if she had been reaching for Niina, even in her final moments. The sounds of the struggle, the heavy footsteps, the scraping of furniture, these finally reached Mikio in his study. He burst out of the room and into the hallway, confronting the intruder directly. There was a fight. Mikio was a grown man, healthy and desperate to protect what remained of his family, but he was unarmed and caught off guard. The knife wounds he sustained were numerous, concentrated on his hands and arms as he tried to defend himself, and then his chest and neck as the attacker overpowered him. He collapsed near the top of the stairs, his blood pooling on the wooden floor. Ray, the youngest, woke in his bed. He was found later in his room, still under his blankets, killed where he lay. He likely never fully understood what was happening. The entire sequence, from the first attack to the last, had taken less than an hour, and then the house went silent. What happened next was what turned this crime from a tragedy into something far more disturbing. The killer did not leave. He moved through the house, stepping over the bodies as if they were furniture. He went into the bathroom and washed his hands, carefully cleaning the blood from his skin. His own hand had been injured during the struggle with Mikio, a deep cut that left traces of his blood mixed with the victim's. He wrapped the wound in cloth torn from the house, then continued exploring. He went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, pulling out ice cream, eating it slowly, leaving the empty containers on the counter. He used the family computer, logging on to the internet and visiting several websites, his actions calm and deliberate. Investigators would later recover the browsing history, finding searches related to theater performances, travel destinations, nothing that suggested panic or guilt. He changed his clothes, discarding his blood-stained shirt and jacket in a bag, putting on a sweater he found in Mikio's closet. He sat on the sofa in the living room, resting, perhaps watching the hours pass. At one point, he used the toilet and did not flush, leaving biological evidence that would later provide a full DNA profile. He drank from the family's water pitcher. He moved papers on the desk. He touched doorknobs, light switches, the banister. It was as if he had decided to live in the house for a while, as if the presence of 4 dead bodies just feet away meant nothing to him. Forensic experts would later describe the scene as one of the most evidence-rich crime scenes they had ever encountered. Fingerprints on multiple surfaces, footprints in blood that showed his exact path through the house, fibers from his clothing, even sand particles in his shoes that suggested he had recently been near a beach or construction site. And yet, despite all of this, despite the wealth of physical evidence, no match was ever found in any database. The killer was a ghost, leaving everything behind except his identity. When the bodies were discovered the next morning by Yasuko's mother, who had come to visit for New Year's preparations, the house was empty. The intruder had finally left, sometime in the early hours, slipping out the same way he had entered. Police arrived within minutes, securing the scene and beginning what would become one of the largest investigations in Japanese history. Over the next weeks and months, thousands of officers were deployed, tens of thousands of interviews conducted, every piece of evidence analyzed and reanalyzed. The DNA profile was clear, belonging to a male of mixed Asian and European descent, a rare genetic combination that should have made identification easier. The fingerprints were distinct, undamaged, perfect for comparison. The clothing left behind included a jacket and a hat, both traced to specific manufacturers, one a brand sold primarily in South Korea, the other a limited release in Japan. The sand in the shoes was analyzed and matched to a particular bay area near an American military base. Everything pointed towards someone with connections to multiple countries, someone who had moved between regions, someone whose life intersected with places where records should exist. And yet, no one came forward. No tip led anywhere. No database, not in Japan, not in South Korea, not in the United States, held a matching profile. It was as if the killer had appeared for one night, committed an act of unfathomable violence, and then vanished back into a world where he did not officially exist. The psychological profile developed by investigators painted a picture that only deepened the mystery. The killer was likely in his 20s or early 30s, physically fit, capable of sustained violence, but also possessing an eerie calmness afterward. The fact that he stayed in the house suggested a complete lack of empathy, an inability to feel fear or remorse in the presence of death. Some experts speculated that he might have been familiar with the house, that he had watched the family, learned their routines, but others argued that the crime felt opportunistic, as if he had simply chosen that night, that house, for reasons known only to him. The use of the family's own knife, rather than bringing a weapon, suggested either impulsiveness or a desire to remain unconnected to premeditation. The hours spent afterward, the casual use of their belongings, the unhurried browsing of the internet, all of it pointed towards someone who felt no urgency, no connection between his actions and any potential consequence. It was the behavior of someone who believed, perhaps rightly, that he would never be caught. And so far, he has been proven correct. The case remains open, the evidence preserved, the investigation technically active, but as the years have passed, hope has dimmed. The Miyazawa family was buried together. Their home was eventually torn down, replaced by a small park with a memorial stone. And somewhere, the man who killed them, who sat in their home and ate their food and touched their belongings, continues to live his life, unknown and unreachable. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But the horror of what people are capable of, the quiet terror of violence that makes no sense, does not end with one family. Sometimes the mystery is not just who committed the act, but why the act was performed with such care, such precision, as if it were not a crime at all, but a ritual. In another part of Tokyo, 6 years earlier, something equally disturbing unfolded. Not in a home, but in the open, in a public park where people walked their dogs and children played on swings. What was found there would challenge every assumption about randomness, about rage, about the way a human body can be treated when someone decides it is no longer a person but an object, to be carefully, methodically dismantled. In late April of 1994, a man walking his dog through Inokashira Park in western Tokyo noticed something odd near the edge of a trash bin. The dog had pulled toward it, sniffing insistently, and when the man looked closer, he saw plastic bags, black and neatly tied, sitting just beside the bin rather than inside it. At first he assumed it was ordinary trash, perhaps too heavy or awkwardly shaped to fit through the opening. But something about the way the bags were arranged, so carefully, so deliberately, made him pause. He did not open them himself. Instead, he called the park office, and they in turn called the police. When the bags were opened, what was inside made even the most experienced officers step back in shock. The bags contained human remains, but not in the way one might expect from a murder or an accident. These were not discarded in panic or hidden in haste. They had been cleaned, prepared, and divided with a precision that suggested someone had taken their time, someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it with a level of care that felt profoundly wrong. The remains belonged to a man in his mid-30s, later identified as a Tokyo resident who had been reported missing several days earlier. His body had been completely dismembered, separated into sections that were almost surgical in their uniformity. The cuts were clean, made with a sharp blade and executed with confidence. There were no jagged edges, no signs of hesitation or error. Each limb had been severed at the joints, the torso divided into manageable pieces, the head removed and wrapped separately. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the condition of the remains. They had been washed thoroughly, with no blood, no tissue residue, no dirt or debris. The plastic bags themselves were common, the kind sold in any convenience store, but they had been doubled, as if to ensure nothing leaked, nothing escaped. The bags had been placed in the park, not hidden deep in the woods or buried under leaves, but near a well-used path where they would be found quickly. It was as if the person responsible wanted the body discovered, wanted someone to see the work they had done. The placement felt intentional, almost ceremonial, a presentation rather than a disposal. Inokashira Park was a popular spot, especially in spring when the cherry blossoms bloomed and families came to picnic under the trees. It was large, with winding paths, a central pond where people rented boats, and wooded areas that offered shade and quiet. The park saw hundreds of visitors each day, and yet no one had reported seeing anything unusual in the days leading up to the discovery. No one had noticed someone carrying heavy bags. No one had seen a person acting suspiciously near the trash bins. The lack of witnesses was baffling given how public the location was. It suggested that whoever had left the remains had done so either very early in the morning or very late at night, during the brief hours when the park was empty. But even then, the act would have required time and confidence. The bags were not light. Moving them, arranging them, ensuring they were positioned just so. All of this would have taken minutes, perhaps longer. And yet, it had been done without detection, without leaving any trace beyond the remains themselves. The investigation began immediately, with police cordoning off large sections of the park and conducting a thorough search for additional evidence. They found nothing. No murder weapon, no bloodstains, no drag marks, no footprints that could be isolated or traced. The ground was too well trafficked, too disturbed by the daily flow of visitors to preserve any single person's trail. The trash bin itself was examined for fingerprints, but it was a public receptacle, touched by dozens of people each day, making it impossible to isolate any one individual. The plastic bags were analyzed, but they were a common brand, sold in thousands of stores across Tokyo, untraceable to any specific purchase. The victim's clothing was missing, presumably removed before the dismemberment, and was never recovered. His personal belongings, wallet, phone, keys, were also absent, leaving no immediate clues as to where he had been before his death or who he had been with. What the police did have was the body itself, and it was the body that told the most unsettling part of the story. The medical examiner's report detailed findings that went beyond typical forensic analysis and into the realm of the deeply strange. The dismemberment had been performed with a level of skill that suggested either medical training or significant experience with anatomy. The cuts followed natural lines of separation, joints disarticulated rather than hacked through, bones left intact wherever possible. It was the kind of work that required knowledge, not just of where to cut, but how to do so efficiently with minimal damage to surrounding tissue. The blade used was likely a long, thin knife, possibly a boning knife or something similar, kept extremely sharp and handled with precision. There were no hesitation marks, no false starts, nothing that indicated the person had been unsure or inexperienced. In fact, the work was so clean that some investigators initially wondered if it had been done by a professional butcher or a surgeon, someone whose livelihood involved cutting meat or tissue with exactness. But as interviews were conducted with individuals in those fields, no one emerged as a suspect. No one had recent connections to the victim. No one had a motive, or at least none that could be identified. The victim himself had been an ordinary man, working in a mid-level office position, living alone in a small apartment not far from the park. He had no known enemies, no debts, no conflicts with coworkers or neighbors. His routine had been predictable: work during the week, quiet evenings at home, occasional visits to nearby shops or restaurants. He was not involved in anything illegal, had no ties to organized crime, no history of violence or risky behavior. His disappearance had been noticed when he failed to show up for work, and his family, worried, had filed a missing person report. But there had been nothing in his life that suggested danger. Nothing that explained why he had become the target of such an elaborate and disturbing act. The randomness of his selection, if indeed it was random, was part of what made the case so frightening. It implied that the person responsible had not chosen him for any particular reason, but simply because he had been available, because he had crossed paths with someone who saw him not as a human being but as material, something to be used and then displayed. As the investigation continued, police began to explore the possibility that the dismemberment had taken place elsewhere, in a private location, where the killer could work undisturbed, and the remains had been transported to the park afterward. This theory made sense logistically. It would explain the lack of blood or evidence at the park itself, and it would account for the level of care taken in the preparation. But finding that location proved impossible. There were no reports of unusual activity in the victim's apartment, no signs of forced entry or struggle. His home was clean, ordinary, showing no evidence of violence or even of him having returned there after his disappearance. Investigators checked storage units, abandoned buildings, workshops, anywhere that might provide the privacy and space needed for such an act, but nothing connected. The killer had managed to acquire a location, commit the dismemberment, clean everything thoroughly, and then transport the remains to a public park, all without leaving a single trace that could be followed. It was a level of operational competence that suggested planning, forethought, and a disturbing level of calm under pressure. Public reaction to the case was intense. Inokashira Park, once seen as a peaceful retreat, became associated with horror. Attendance dropped sharply in the weeks following the discovery, and even months later, some visitors avoided the areas near where the remains had been found. The media coverage was extensive, with newspapers running detailed stories about the dismemberment, the precision of the cuts, the clean condition of the remains. Speculation ran wild, with theories ranging from Yakuza involvement to the work of a medical student practicing techniques, to the possibility of a serial killer who had simply not been caught yet. But none of these theories held up under scrutiny. The Yakuza, while certainly capable of violence, typically did not engage in this kind of elaborate dismemberment. Their methods were blunt, designed to send messages, not to showcase skill. A medical student would have had access to facilities, to supervision, to a context that made such an act nearly impossible without detection. And if this were the work of a serial killer, there were no other cases that matched the same pattern, no other victims found in similar conditions, no signature that repeated across crimes. The police conducted thousands of interviews, reviewed hours of security footage from nearby businesses, and followed up on every tip that came in, no matter how unlikely. They created a timeline of the victim's last known movements, tracing him from his workplace to a small restaurant where he had eaten dinner alone, and then onto a train heading toward his apartment. Security footage showed him exiting the station near his home, walking in the direction of his building, and then nothing. He vanished somewhere in that short walk, a distance of less than 10 minutes on foot, in a residential neighborhood where people should have been around, where lights were on in windows, where someone should have seen something, but no one did. Or if they did not realize what they were seeing, did not understand that the man walking past them, or standing at a corner, or getting into a car, was about to disappear forever. The case grew cold slowly, not all at once. Leads dried up, witnesses had nothing new to offer, forensic re-examinations yielded no breakthroughs. The remains were eventually released to the victim's family, and he was cremated in a quiet ceremony, attended by a small group of relatives and friends. The park returned to normal, or as normal as it could be, with the memory of what had been found there lingering like a stain that could not be washed away. Police kept the case open, technically active, but as the years passed, attention shifted to newer crimes, more recent tragedies. The man who had been dismembered with such care, whose body had been prepared and displayed with such strange precision, became another name on a list of unsolved cases, another victim whose killer would likely never be found. And somewhere, the person responsible for it all, the one who had known exactly where to cut, who had washed away every trace of blood, who had carried the remains to a public park and arranged them like an offering, continued to live their life, anonymous and untouchable, carrying the knowledge of what they had done in a silence that would never be broken. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. These first two stories show us how horror does not always announce itself with screams or chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, methodically, leaving behind only questions and the cold realization that some acts of violence are performed not in madness, but in a calm, deliberate clarity that is far more terrifying. But if you thought these cases were disturbing, what comes next will take us even deeper into the unknown, into incidents where the lines between accident, intention, and something darker blur completely, where the evidence points in so many directions that the truth becomes impossible to grasp, and where the people involved vanished, leaving behind only silence and speculation. In the spring of 1981, a series of murders began in Tokyo's Kabukicho district that would terrify the city for months. The victims were young women, strangled in love hotels, the kind of discreet establishments where anonymity was part of the service. But what made these killings so disturbing was not just the violence itself, it was the calm, ordinary manner of the man who committed them. He walked in with his victims, spoke quietly at the front desk, paid in cash, and disappeared before anyone realized what had happened. No one who saw him found him memorable. No one thought to look twice. He was just another customer in a district where thousands passed through every night, and that normalcy, that ability to blend seamlessly into the background, made him almost impossible to catch. Kabukicho was Tokyo's red light district, a dense maze of narrow streets packed with bars, clubs, massage parlors, and love hotels. The area operated under its own rules, a place where business was conducted discreetly and questions were rarely asked. Love hotels in particular were designed for privacy, with entrances that allowed guests to check in without ever speaking to staff face-to-face, rooms that could be rented by the hour, and exits that let people leave unnoticed. It was the perfect environment for someone who wanted to commit a crime without being seen, without being remembered. The district attracted all kinds of people: salarymen looking to unwind after work, couples seeking privacy, tourists curious about Tokyo's nightlife. It was loud, chaotic, and always moving, a place where individual faces disappeared into the crowd. The first murder happened in mid-March, when a young woman in her early 20s was found dead in a room at a modest hotel near the main avenue. She had checked in with a man around midnight. The night clerk remembered processing the payment, a standard transaction, nothing unusual. When housekeeping entered the room the next morning, they found her body on the bed, her neck bruised and her face pale. The man she had arrived with was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that she had fought back or tried to escape. It was as if she had been caught completely off guard, as if the attack had happened so quickly that she had no time to react. Police began their investigation by interviewing the hotel staff, but the descriptions they received were frustratingly vague. The man had been in his late 20s or early 30s, average height, dark hair, wearing a suit or business casual clothing. He had spoken politely, kept his head down, and left no impression beyond basic civility. The night clerk could not recall any distinguishing features, no scars, no unusual mannerisms, nothing that set him apart from the hundreds of other men who passed through the hotel each week. Security footage from the lobby was grainy, shot from an angle that obscured faces, showing only silhouettes and movement. The woman had been a hostess working at a nearby club, someone who interacted with customers as part of her job, and while her coworkers were shocked by her death, none of them could identify anyone who might have wanted to harm her. She had no known conflicts, no jealous ex-partners, no debts or entanglements that might explain why she had become a target. To the police, it seemed like a random act, a terrible coincidence, a single violent incident in a district where danger was always lurking just beneath the surface. But then, 6 weeks later, it happened again. The second victim was found in a different hotel, a few blocks away, under nearly identical circumstances. She was in her mid-20s, also working in the entertainment industry, and she had checked in with a man late at night. The staff remembered the transaction, but could not describe the man with any clarity. He had been polite, quiet, dressed neatly. When the body was discovered, the cause of death was the same: strangulation, manual, no weapon involved, just hands pressed against her throat until she stopped breathing. Again, there were no signs of a struggle. Again, the man had vanished before anyone noticed. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore, and police began to suspect they were dealing with a serial killer. They increased patrols in the area, distributed sketches based on the vague descriptions they had collected, and urged businesses to report any suspicious behavior. But Kabukicho was a place where suspicious behavior was the norm, where people came specifically to avoid scrutiny, and the warnings went largely unheeded. The district continued to operate as it always had: crowded, transactional, and indifferent to the fear building beneath its surface. In early June, a third woman was attacked, but this time she survived. She had met a man at a bar, someone who seemed friendly, well-mannered, and interested in her company. They had talked for a while, and when he suggested they go somewhere more private, she agreed, seeing nothing in his demeanor that suggested danger. They walked together to a nearby love hotel, checked in, and went upstairs to a room. It was there, once the door was closed, that everything changed. He moved suddenly, grabbing her by the throat, forcing her back against the wall. She tried to scream, but his grip was too tight, cutting off her air and her voice. She clawed at his hands, kicked, struggled with everything she had, and somehow, in the chaos, she managed to twist free. She fell to the floor, gasping, and scrambled toward the door. He hesitated, just for a moment, as if deciding whether to pursue her or flee, and that hesitation was enough. She yanked the door open and ran into the hallway, shouting for help. By the time hotel staff reached the room, the man was gone, slipping out through a side exit before anyone could stop him. The woman was rushed to the hospital, bruised and shaken but alive, and when police arrived to interview her, they finally had a witness who could provide details. Her description matched what others had said: a man in his late 20s or early 30s, average height, dark hair, wearing a neat shirt and slacks. But she added more, specifics that the previous witnesses had not been able to recall. His voice had been calm, almost soothing, even as he attacked her. He had not said anything threatening beforehand, no warnings, no demands. He had simply switched from pleasant conversation to violence in an instant, as if he had been wearing a mask that he could remove at will. His hands, she said, had been strong but not rough, as if he had done this before, as if he knew exactly how much pressure to apply. And his face, even in those terrifying moments, had remained eerily composed, not twisted with rage or excitement, just blank, focused, mechanical. She told police that if she had passed him on the street afterward, she might not have recognized him, not because she could not remember his face, but because there was something about him that refused to stick in memory, something aggressively ordinary that made him impossible to pin down. Despite having a surviving witness, despite having her detailed account, the investigation stalled. The sketches that were created, based on her description, were circulated throughout Kabukicho and beyond, but they depicted a man who looked like thousands of others in Tokyo, someone who could disappear into any crowd without effort. Tips came in, but none led anywhere. Men were questioned, alibis checked, but no one fit the profile closely enough to warrant arrest. The psychological profile developed by investigators suggested someone with a deep disconnect from empathy, someone who viewed his victims not as people but as objects, opportunities. The lack of sexual assault in the murders was noted as unusual. The attacks seemed motivated not by desire but by something else, a need for control, perhaps, or simply the act of killing itself. The choice of love hotels as the location suggested someone who understood how to exploit the environment, someone who knew that privacy and discretion would work in his favor, that staff would not intervene, that witnesses would be scarce. It was methodical, calculated, and disturbingly effective. Public fear intensified as the details of the case became widely known. Women working in Kabukicho's entertainment industry began taking extra precautions, traveling in groups, avoiding unfamiliar clients, checking in with friends to ensure someone knew where they were. Hotels increased their security, some installing better cameras, others training staff to watch for suspicious behavior, though what that behavior might look like remained frustratingly unclear. The police presence in the district grew, with officers conducting random checks and interviewing anyone who seemed out of place, but the sheer volume of people moving through the area each night made effective surveillance nearly impossible, and the killer, whoever he was, seemed to understand this. After the failed attack on the surviving victim, he stopped. No more bodies were found. No more women reported similar encounters. It was as if he had simply decided to walk away, satisfied with what he had done, or perhaps recognizing that continuing would increase his chances of being caught. Theories about his identity ranged widely. Some investigators believed he was a local, someone who lived or worked in Kabukicho and knew the district intimately. Others thought he might be a visitor, someone who came to the area specifically to commit his crimes before returning to a life elsewhere, a life where no one suspected him of anything. The possibility that he was a salaryman, someone with a respectable job and a normal appearance, was considered seriously. It would explain his ability to blend in, his calm demeanor, his access to the kinds of clothes and manners that put people at ease. But without physical evidence, without a name or a face that could be verified, every theory remained just that, speculation without proof. The case files grew thick with reports, witness statements, forensic analyses, but none of it led to an arrest. The murders remained unsolved. The killer, unidentified, a shadow that had moved through Kabukicho for a few terrible months before vanishing as completely as if he had never existed. Years later, when detectives revisited the case with fresh eyes and new technology, they found nothing that earlier investigators had missed. The evidence was simply too limited, the witnesses too uncertain, the killer too careful. The surviving victim, when contacted, said she still thought about that night, about the man who had tried to kill her, and how she had walked past dozens of men since then who could have been him. She said the worst part was not knowing, not having closure, living with the awareness that he was still out there, perhaps still living a normal life, perhaps even having forgotten what he had done. The families of the women who had been killed were left with the same unanswered questions, the same hollow absence where justice should have been. And Kabukicho, for all its chaos and noise, carried the memory of those months like a scar, a reminder that danger did not always announce itself, that sometimes it wore a pleasant face and spoke in a calm voice, and by the time you realized what was happening, it was already too late. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But while that case showed us the horror of a predator moving through crowds unseen, there are crimes where the danger does not emerge from anonymity in physical space, but from the faceless void of the internet, where strangers can connect, plan, and act without ever meeting face to face, where violence is organized like a game, detached from reality until it becomes terrifyingly real. What happened next took place decades later, in a world where technology had created new ways for darkness to spread, and where the boundary between online fantasy and real-world horror dissolved in the most brutal way imaginable. On the morning of August 31st, 2007, a young woman named Ri Isogai left her apartment in Nagoya, heading to the train station for her commute to work. She was 31 years old, employed at an office job that she had held for several years, and she lived a quiet, predictable life. She had no reason to believe that morning would be different from any other, no reason to think that anyone was watching her, waiting for her. But 3 men had been planning for weeks, coordinating through messages on an anonymous online forum, discussing their intentions with a cold detachment that treated the idea of harming someone as if it were a hypothetical exercise, a dark joke that none of them believed would actually happen. Except it did. When Ree stepped off the train and began walking toward her office, they were already there, waiting, and what they did to her over the next hours would expose a side of internet culture that most people preferred not to acknowledge, a place where violence could be discussed, refined, and executed as if it were entertainment. The three men had never met in person before that day. They knew each other only through screen names, usernames on a dark web message board that catered to people with violent fantasies and antisocial impulses. The forum was hidden, accessible only through specific links, and it existed in the shadowy corners of the internet where moderation was non-existent and users felt emboldened by anonymity. Conversations on the board ranged from disturbing hypotheticals to explicit discussions of harm, with users trading ideas, techniques, and encouragement. Most participants, investigators would later believe, never intended to act on what they discussed, treating the forum as an outlet for thoughts they would never express elsewhere. But for these three men, the line between fantasy and reality blurred. They began talking about committing a real crime, targeting a real person, and as the conversation continued, the idea solidified into a plan. They chose Rie almost at random, identifying her through online research, learning her routine by following social media breadcrumbs and public records. She became their target, not because of anything she had done, not because of any connection to them, but simply because they decided she was accessible, vulnerable, and unlikely to be immediately missed. The planning was disturbingly methodical. They discussed where to approach her, what time of day would offer the least witnesses, what tools they would need, and how they would dispose of evidence. They talked about it the way someone might plan a weekend trip, with casual efficiency, as if the fact that they were discussing kidnapping and murder was secondary to the logistics. One of the men was in his early 30s, employed in a low-level technical job, living alone and spending most of his free time online. Another was in his mid-20s, unemployed, still living with his parents, and struggling to find direction in life. The third was slightly older, married, with a surface-level appearance of normalcy that would later shock those who knew him. None of them had criminal records. None of them had histories of violence. To the outside world, they were unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of men who blended into the background of everyday life. But in the privacy of their online conversations, they revealed something else, a willingness to harm, a curiosity about what it would feel like, and a shared belief that they could get away with it if they were careful enough. On the day of the attack, they converged on the area near the train station, each arriving separately, communicating through their phones to coordinate their positions. When Rhea appeared, walking along the sidewalk toward her office, one of them approached her directly, asking for directions. A simple, non-threatening interaction meant to stop her momentum and create an opening. As she paused to respond, the other two moved in, surrounding her, and before she could understand what was happening, they forced her toward a waiting vehicle. It was done quickly, efficiently, in a span of seconds that left no time for her to scream or for passers-by to register what they were seeing. To anyone watching, it might have looked like friends helping someone into a car, an awkward moment but not an emergency. By the time anyone might have thought to question it, the car was already moving, carrying Rhea away from the busy street and into a nightmare she could not have anticipated. They drove her to a remote location, an isolated area outside the city where they believed they could act without interruption. The details of what happened next are difficult to recount, not because they are unknown, but because they are so profoundly disturbing that even summarizing them feels like participating in the horror. They robbed her, taking her phone, her wallet, anything of value, though the theft seemed almost incidental, an afterthought to the real purpose of the abduction. They attempted to assault her, but she resisted, fighting with a desperation born of absolute terror, and in their frustration, they turned to violence. The attack was brutal, prolonged, and devoid of any humanity. They did not see her as a person. They saw her as an object, something they had acquired through their planning, something they could do with as they pleased. And when they were finished, when they realized she was still alive and could identify them, they made the decision to kill her. They strangled her, holding her down until she stopped moving, until her body went limp and the light left her eyes. And then, with the same cold detachment they had shown throughout, they discussed how to dispose of the body. They placed her remains in a remote wooded area, covering her with branches and debris in a shallow attempt at concealment. They believed, perhaps, that it would take days or weeks before she was found, giving them time to distance themselves, to return to their normal lives as if nothing had happened. But they had underestimated how quickly Ria's absence would be noticed. Her family, worried when she did not return home, reported her missing that same evening. Her co-workers, surprised when she failed to arrive at the office, confirmed that she had left for work as usual. Police began a search, and within 2 days, her body was discovered. The investigation moved quickly from there, driven by the urgency of a fresh crime scene and the possibility that evidence had not yet been destroyed. What detectives found when they began tracing Ria's final hours led them into the dark corners of the internet and to a chat log that would become central to the case. One of the men, either out of arrogance or carelessness, had continued posting on the forum after the murder, describing what they had done in vague but unmistakable terms. Other users on the board initially assumed he was lying, engaging in the kind of dark fantasy that was common in those spaces. But as details began to match news reports about Ri's disappearance, some users grew uneasy. An anonymous tip was sent to police, directing them to the forum and the specific conversation thread. Investigators obtained a warrant, worked with internet service providers to trace the users' IP addresses, and within days, they had identified the 3 men. Arrests were made swiftly, and during interrogations, all 3 confessed, though their accounts varied in how much responsibility each claimed. They pointed fingers at one another, arguing over who had initiated what, who had gone too far, as if the question of degrees mattered when the outcome had been murder. The trial that followed horrified Japan. It was not just the crime itself, though that was monstrous enough. It was the revelation of how it had been planned, how casually they had discussed it, how they had treated it as a collaborative project, something to be optimized and executed. The chat logs were presented as evidence, and reading them, people struggled to reconcile the detached, almost playful tone of the messages with the violent reality they described. The men had used emoticons, abbreviations, casual slang, as if they were discussing a video game rather than a human life. There was no remorse in those messages, no hesitation, no moment where any of them suggested they should stop. It was a window into a mindset that most people could not comprehend, one where empathy had been eroded so completely that another person's suffering was just an abstract concept, something interesting to explore rather than something to avoid. The defense attempted to argue that the internet culture had played a role, that the anonymity and constant exposure to violent content had desensitized the men, making them less able to distinguish between fantasy and reality. But the prosecution countered that millions of people used the internet, visited dark corners of forums, and never harmed anyone. The issue was not the platform. It was the individuals, their choices, their willingness to turn thought into action. The psychological evaluations conducted on the men revealed varying degrees of antisocial traits, but none were deemed legally insane. They had known what they were doing. They had understood it was wrong. They had simply decided that their curiosity, their desire to experience something forbidden, was more important than the life of another human being. The court found them guilty, sentencing them to lengthy prison terms, though many felt that no sentence could adequately address the horror of what had been done. Ree's family spoke publicly after the trial, describing the person she had been, the daughter, the sister, the friend whose life had been stolen for no reason beyond the entertainment of strangers. They talked about the absence she left behind, the milestones she would never reach, the future that had been erased. They expressed disbelief that something so evil could be planned so casually, that people could sit in their rooms, type messages, and arrange a murder as if they were organizing a meetup. The case became a turning point in how Japan viewed internet anonymity and the darker subcultures that thrived in unmoderated spaces. Laws were discussed, though implementation proved difficult given the borderless nature of online communication. Forums like the one where the crime had been planned continued to exist, sometimes migrating to new servers, new domains, always staying one step ahead of attempts to shut them down. What made Ree's murder so deeply unsettling was not just the brutality, but the randomness, the sense that she had been selected by pure chance. That if the men had chosen a different day or a different target, she would still be alive, and someone else would be mourning. It highlighted a kind of danger that felt impossible to defend against, because it did not come from someone you knew, someone you had angered, or someone with a clear motive. It came from strangers who had never seen you as anything more than a name on a screen, an opportunity to satisfy a curiosity about violence. And that realization that the internet had made it possible for people to find each other, to reinforce each other's worst impulses, and to act collectively on fantasies that might have remained dormant in isolation, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. The three men are still in prison, their names known, their crime documented, but the forum where they met has likely been replaced by others, and the conversations that happen there continue in the shadows, quiet and persistent, waiting for the next moment when someone decides to cross the line from words to action. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The horror we have explored so far has been loud in its aftermath. Crimes that shocked communities, that filled news reports, that demanded investigations and trials. But the final two stories are different. They are quieter, more intimate, and in some ways more disturbing because they deal not with strangers or predators, but with the people we think we know, the ones who live next door, the ones who seem ordinary until the moment they are not. These are the stories that stay with you long after the telling ends, because they remind us that the greatest horrors are not always hidden in dark alleys or anonymous forums, but sometimes in the most familiar places, waiting patiently behind closed doors. On the morning of June 4th, 2020, in the quiet residential city of Takarazuka, Hyogo Prefecture, neighbors heard sounds they could not immediately identify, sharp cracks that might have been fireworks or construction noise, followed by shouting that faded quickly into silence. No one thought to investigate right away. It was a Thursday, a work day, and most people assumed whatever was happening would resolve itself. But inside one particular house, a family was being systematically killed by someone they had lived with, trusted, and raised. The weapon was not a knife or a gun, but a crossbow, an unusual choice that made the attack feel both medieval and coldly premeditated. By the time police arrived, 3 people were dead. 1 was critically injured, and the young man responsible was sitting calmly in the house, waiting, as if he had known all along that this was how the day would end. The family had lived in Takarazuka for years, a multi-generational household that included a grandmother in her 70s, her daughter in her 50s, and 2 adult children, a son and a daughter. The son, 23 years old, had been living at home since finishing high school, never quite finding his footing in the world beyond the house. He had attended university briefly, but dropped out, citing stress and an inability to connect with other students. He had tried working part-time jobs, but never lasted more than a few weeks, always finding some reason to quit. His family supported him, as families often do, believing that with time and patience, he would find his way. They gave him space, asked few questions, and allowed him the freedom to spend his days however he chose. What they did not know was that he had been using that freedom to plan something terrible, researching weapons online, watching videos about how to use them, and quietly acquiring the tools he would need. He had ordered a crossbow through an online retailer, a legal purchase that required no background check, no questions asked. It arrived in a nondescript package, and he brought it into the house without anyone noticing, hiding it in a room along with the bolts he had purchased separately. The tension in the household had been building for months, though none of it was obvious to outsiders. The young man had become increasingly withdrawn, spending almost all his time in his room, emerging only for meals or when called. His mother worried about him, asking if he was feeling all right, suggesting he see a doctor or talk to someone, but he deflected her concerns with vague reassurances. His grandmother, more traditional in her views, believed he simply needed discipline, that he was wasting his life and needed to take responsibility. His brother, older by a few years and already working full-time, found the situation frustrating, feeling that he had to carry the family's expectations while his younger sibling contributed nothing. There were arguments, quiet but persistent, about the future, about responsibility, about what it meant to be part of a family. The young man listened to these conversations with a growing resentment, internalizing every criticism, every expression of disappointment, until it hardened into something darker. He began to believe that they did not understand him, that they saw him as a burden, that they would be happier if he were gone. And then, in a twisted inversion of that logic, he decided they were the problem, not him. On the morning of the attack, the family was home, going about their routines. The grandmother was in the kitchen, preparing tea. The mother was folding laundry in the living room. The brother was getting ready for work, moving between his bedroom and the bathroom. The young man waited until they were separated, until each person was alone in a different part of the house, and then he retrieved the crossbow from his room. He had practiced loading it, aiming it, understanding the mechanics, and now, standing in the hallway with the weapon in his hands, he felt a strange calm. There was no hesitation, no moment where he reconsidered. He had thought about this for weeks, and now it was simply time to act. He went to his grandmother first, finding her in the kitchen, her back to the doorway. He raised the crossbow, aimed, and fired. The bolt struck her in the back, and she collapsed without a sound, her body falling forward against the counter. He reloaded quickly, moving through the house with purpose. His mother was next, still in the living room, folding clothes. She heard him approach and turned, perhaps expecting a normal interaction, perhaps about to ask him something, but before she could speak, he fired. The bolt hit her in the chest, and she fell back onto the sofa, her hands reaching up as if to pull the bolt out, but her strength faded before she could. He reloaded again, his movements mechanical, efficient, as if he were completing a task on a checklist. His brother heard the commotion, the sound of something falling, and came out of his room to investigate. He saw his younger sibling standing in the hallway, holding the crossbow, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The older brother's face shifted from confusion to horror as he realized what was happening, and he turned to run, heading for the front door, shouting for help. The younger brother raised the crossbow and fired, the bolt striking his sibling in the back as he reached for the door handle. He fell forward, collapsing against the door, his body blocking the exit. The young man reloaded once more, approaching the body, and fired again at close range, ensuring there would be no survival, no chance of escape. And then, as if following a script he had written in his mind, he turned his attention to the final target, his aunt, who had arrived at the house earlier that morning to visit. The aunt had been upstairs, unaware of what was happening below. She heard the shouting, the sound of her nephew's footsteps on the stairs, and stepped into the hallway to see what was wrong. She saw him coming toward her, saw the crossbow in his hands, and in that instant understood everything. She turned and ran back into the room she had been in, slamming the door and locking it. But the door was thin, not designed to withstand force. He kicked it open, the lock splintering, and she backed away, looking for something to defend herself with, finding nothing. He aimed the crossbow at her head and fired. The bolt struck her directly, but by sheer chance, she had been wearing a bicycle helmet, something she had put on earlier because she had planned to ride her bike home later that day. The bolt hit the helmet, cracking it, penetrating partway through, but the helmet absorbed enough of the impact that the bolt did not fully pierce her skull. She fell, dazed and bleeding, but alive. He reloaded, preparing to fire again, but at that moment he heard sirens in the distance. Someone, perhaps a neighbor who had finally grown concerned about the noises, had called the police. He hesitated, lowering the crossbow, and then, as if the urgency had drained out of him, he simply stopped. He walked back downstairs, placed the crossbow on the floor, and sat down on the sofa next to his mother's body, waiting. When police entered the house, they found a scene of devastation. 3 bodies, the grandmother, the mother, and the brother, each killed with crossbow bolts that had been fired with precision. The aunt was upstairs, barely conscious, her helmet still on her head, the bolt embedded in it. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, where doctors marveled at the bizarre twist of fate that had saved her life. The helmet, worn for an unrelated reason, had prevented what would have been a fatal injury. The young man offered no resistance when he was arrested. He confessed immediately, providing details about how he had planned the attack, where he had purchased the crossbow, how he had practiced in his room when the house was empty. His tone was flat, emotionless, as if he were describing something he had watched rather than something he had done. When asked why, he gave vague answers about feeling unappreciated, about believing his family wanted him to disappear, about thinking this was the only way to solve his problems. Psychologists who evaluated him found him to have traits consistent with severe social withdrawal and distorted thinking, but he was deemed competent to stand trial. The case shocked Japan, not just because of the violence, but because of the weapon. Crossbows were not commonly used in crimes, and the fact that one had been purchased so easily, with no oversight, prompted widespread discussions about online sales and weapon regulations. The image of a young man methodically hunting his own family through their home with a medieval weapon felt surreal, like something out of fiction rather than reality. But the evidence was undeniable. The bodies, the bolts, the helmet with its cracked surface. The aunt, once she had recovered enough to speak, described the attack in chilling detail, how calm he had seemed, how purposeful, how there had been no anger in his face, just a blank determination. She said the worst part was not the pain or the fear, but the realization that the person trying to kill her was someone she had known since he was a child, someone she had held, someone she had never imagined capable of such an act. The trial moved quickly, the evidence overwhelming. and he was sentenced to life in prison. His father, who had been at work during the attack, gave a brief statement expressing disbelief and grief, saying he did not recognize the person his son had become. What remains most disturbing about the case is the sense that it could have been prevented, that the warning signs were there but were either missed or dismissed. The young man's isolation, his lack of engagement with the world, his growing resentment, all of it pointed towards someone who was struggling deeply, but no intervention had occurred. The family had tried in their own way, offering support, asking questions, but they had not understood the depth of his detachment, the way his thoughts had spiraled into a place where violence seemed logical, and the ease with which he had acquired the weapon, the lack of any barrier between intention and action, highlighted a gap in systems designed to prevent harm. The crossbow sat in an evidence locker, a strange and terrible artifact of a crime that felt both ancient and disturbingly modern, a reminder that the tools of violence could be anything, and that the real danger was not the weapon itself, but the mind that chose to use it. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But if that story showed us how violence can erupt suddenly within a home, the final case we will examine is different, quieter in some ways, but no less haunting. It is a story where the violence was intimate, where the fire that followed was meant to erase all evidence, and where the mystery of who and why has never been solved. It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying thing is not what we know, but what we will never know, the unanswered questions that linger long after the flames have been extinguished and the investigators have moved on. On the evening of July 22nd, 1996, neighbors in the Shibamata district of Tokyo noticed smoke rising from a modest single-family home. It was a residential area, the kind of place where people knew each other by sight, if not by name, where children played in the streets and elderly residents tended small gardens. The house belonged to the Kobayashi family, and inside lived a young woman named Junko, a 20-year-old university student who was home alone that night. Her parents had gone out earlier in the evening, visiting relatives in another part of the city, and Junko had stayed behind, planning to study for upcoming exams. By the time the first neighbor called the fire department, flames were already visible through the windows, thick black smoke pouring out into the evening air. Firefighters arrived quickly, working to contain the blaze before it spread to neighboring homes, and within an hour, the fire was under control. But when they entered the charred remains of the house, they found something that turned a tragic accident into a murder investigation. Junko's body was inside, but she had not died from the fire. She had been killed before the flames ever started. Junko had been a quiet, studious young woman, enrolled in a local university where she was studying literature. She was known among her classmates as someone who kept to herself, polite and friendly, but not particularly social. She spent most of her time either at school or at home, helping her parents with household tasks, reading, preparing for her future. She had no known enemies, no conflicts with anyone, no romantic entanglements that had ended badly. Her parents described her as responsible, careful, someone who followed rules and avoided risks. The idea that anyone would want to harm her seemed incomprehensible, and yet the evidence was clear. The autopsy revealed that she had been struck on the head with a blunt object, the blow severe enough to cause immediate unconsciousness, possibly death. The fire had been set afterward, likely in an attempt to destroy evidence, to make it appear as though she had died in an accidental house fire. But the medical examiner could distinguish between injuries caused by trauma and those caused by heat and smoke, and the conclusion was undeniable. Junko had been murdered, and then someone had tried to cover it up. The investigation began with the most obvious questions. Who had access to the house? Who knew Junko would be home alone that night? Who might have had a motive to harm her? Police interviewed her parents extensively, but both had solid alibis, confirmed by the relatives they had been visiting. They interviewed her classmates, her professors, neighbors, anyone who might have had contact with her in the days leading up to her death. No one reported anything unusual. No one had seen a stranger near the house. No one recalled Junko mentioning any concerns or fears. The front door of the house had been locked when firefighters arrived, though it was unclear whether it had been locked from the inside or outside, and the intense heat of the fire had destroyed any fingerprints that might have been on the handle. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no jimmied locks. This suggested two possibilities. Either Junko had known her attacker and let them in willingly, or the attacker had a key and could enter without breaking in. Both possibilities were deeply unsettling, each implying a level of trust or access that made the crime feel personal, intimate. Forensic analysis of the fire revealed that it had been started deliberately, with an accelerant, likely gasoline or kerosene, poured in multiple areas of the house to ensure it spread quickly. The pattern of burn marks indicated that the fire had begun in the living room and the hallway, areas where Junko's body was not found, suggesting that the killer had moved her or that she had been attacked elsewhere in the house and the fire set afterward. Her body had been discovered in her bedroom, on the floor near the door, as if she had been trying to leave the room or had been moved there after the attack. The position of her body, the location of the injuries, the timeline of the fire, all of it painted a picture of someone who had acted with purpose, who had planned at least some of what they were doing, even if the murder itself had been impulsive. The use of fire as a cover-up method suggested a level of desperation, a need to destroy evidence, but it also suggested someone who did not fully understand forensic science, who believed that fire would erase everything, when in reality it often preserved more than it destroyed. Police explored the possibility that Junko had been involved in something her family did not know about, some secret life or hidden relationship that might explain why she became a target. They examined her belongings, her notebooks, her letters, looking for anything that might point toward a motive. They found nothing. Her diary, salvaged partially from the fire, contained only mundane entries about schoolwork, family dinners, books she was reading. There were no mentions of anyone suspicious, no hints of fear or conflict. Her phone records showed only calls to her parents, a few classmates, and her university. There were no mysterious numbers, no patterns that suggested she had been communicating with someone in secret. Her bank account showed no unusual transactions. Her schedule was predictable, routine, offering no clues as to where or how she might have crossed paths with a killer. The investigation began to feel like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, every lead ending in a dead end, every theory collapsing under scrutiny. One possibility that investigators considered was that the killer had been someone passing through the neighborhood, a stranger who had seen an opportunity and acted on it. But this theory had problems. Shibamata was not an area with high crime rates. Strangers were noticed, remembered, and the fact that there had been no forced entry suggested that this was not a random break-in gone wrong. If a stranger had entered the house, Junko would have had to open the door willingly, which seemed unlikely unless the person had a convincing pretext. Another theory was that the killer had been someone Junko knew casually, perhaps a delivery person, a repairman, someone who had legitimate reasons to approach the house and whom she would not have suspected. Police interviewed local businesses, checked records of deliveries and service calls to the neighborhood around that time, but nothing stood out. Everyone who had been in the area had alibis or no connection to Junko. The case began to go cold, not because investigators stopped working on it, but because there was simply nowhere left to look. Years passed, and the case remained unsolved. Junko's parents moved away from Shibamata, unable to stay in a neighborhood where their daughter had been killed, where every street corner reminded them of what they had lost. The house was eventually torn down, the lot sold, a new structure built in its place. But the memory of what had happened there lingered, spoken about in hushed tones by older residents who remembered the night of the fire, the smoke, the sirens, the realization that something terrible had occurred. Theories circulated, as they always do in unsolved cases, ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Some believed it had been a stalker, someone who had fixated on Junko without her knowledge. Others thought it might have been a case of mistaken identity, that the killer had targeted the wrong house, the wrong person. Still, others speculated about darker possibilities, involvement in something criminal, a secret that had died with her. But none of these theories had evidence to support them, and, in the absence of facts, they remained only speculation. What made Junko's case so haunting was not just the violence or the fire, but the sense of incompleteness, the feeling that there was a truth hidden just out of reach, something that would make everything make sense if only it could be uncovered. Her parents, in the few interviews they gave over the years, spoke about that feeling, the way they returned again and again to the same questions, trying to understand who would have wanted to hurt their daughter, why someone would have gone to such lengths to cover up her death. They talked about the small details they could not let go of, the fact that her bedroom door had been closed, the way her textbooks had been neatly stacked on her desk, as if she had been planning to study later, the absence of any signs of struggle in the parts of the house that had not burned completely. It all suggested that whatever had happened, it had happened quickly, that Junko had not had time to fight back, to call for help, to do anything except fall when the blow came. Detectives who worked the case, even those who had since retired, spoke about it as one that stayed with them, one they thought about during quiet moments, wondering if they had missed something, if there was a piece of evidence they had overlooked. Some of them revisited the case files periodically, hoping that new technology, new forensic techniques, might reveal something that earlier methods had not. But the fire had destroyed so much, and the passage of time had scattered witnesses, faded memories, made reconstruction even more difficult. The case remained open technically, the files preserved in a basement storage room, available if new information ever came to light. But as the years turned into decades, the likelihood of that happening grew slimmer. Junko Kobayashi became another name on a long list of unsolved murders. Another young life ended for reasons that would never be fully understood. Another family left to grieve without closure. What her case reminds us, what all of these stories remind us, is that horror is not always loud, not always obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, a door left unlocked, a person who seemed trustworthy, a moment of vulnerability that someone else decided to exploit. It is the knock at the door you answer without thinking, the familiar face that turns out to hide something monstrous, the routine evening that becomes the last one. These are the stories that disturb us most deeply because they strip away the illusion of safety, the belief that if we are careful, if we follow the rules, if we live good lives, we will be protected. Junko was careful. She was home. She was doing nothing wrong. And yet, someone came. Someone hurt her. Someone set fire to her home and walked away, and that person has never been found. The not knowing is part of the horror, the understanding that somewhere, perhaps still in Tokyo, perhaps having moved far away, the person responsible continues to live their life, carrying the secret of what they did, perhaps forgetting it entirely, perhaps remembering it every day. And Junko, who should have graduated, who should have built a career, who should have had a future, is only a memory now, a name in a file, a story told in whispers about the night the house burned and the girl who died before the flames ever reached her. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.